Welcome to US1 Snapshots, where we do little overviews of big themes in US history. Today, Manifest Destiny. Our focus points for today. The United States expansion was motivated by the idea that the American way of life and government was superior and must be spread. This idea, called Manifest Destiny, motivated spreading the USA's influence and control across the western frontier. The impact of this attitude cannot be accurately measured, but was a large part of America's growth. What is Manifest Destiny? This was a term that was first coined by newspaper editor John O'Sullivan in 1845. The right of our manifest destiny to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent which Providence has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty and federative development of self-government entrusted to us. It is right such that of the tree to the space of air, and the earth suitable for the full expansion of its principle and destiny of growth. With this idea, a myth of the West as a land of romance and adventure emerged and became a huge part of American culture. Here we can see a work of art that depicts American Progress as the title by John Gast in 1872. On the left side of the painting, you can see the Native Americans and their lifestyle of chasing buffalo on the Great Plains, in darkness, being chased away by the White Lady of Progress, in her white robe, carrying a school book, a telegraph line, and with settlers behind her. Notice the settlers in covered wagons, possibly moving cattle along. Notice the settlers with a pickaxe, looking for gold, prospectors, as you might call them, and the settlers bringing their steel plows and farms, along with the trains and the telegraphs and the cities that are being brought to the West to civilize the savage wilderness. This myth was a huge part of American culture in the 1800s, to the point where the historian Frederick Jackson Turner actually argued that the spirit and success of the United States was directly tied to the country's westward expansion. He also said that the forging of the unique and rugged American identity occurred at the juncture between the civilization of settlement and the savagery of wilderness. With this notion of conquering the Wild West, a new kind of American identity was totally ingrained into American culture and history. Here we can see the expansion of the United States, first the Louisiana Purchase, and then after So the first expansion was with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, in which lands west of the Mississippi River were purchased from France. Later, Florida was ceded by Spain. And today we're going to talk about the Texas annexation and the Mexican cession of the 1840s, and the United States partially realizing this idea of manifest destiny by colonizing coast to coast. So the first part of our story is going to talk about the Republic of Texas. From 1836 to 1845, Texas had declared itself as an independent country from Mexico. And this started when Mexico invited white American settlers and often offered land grants to them to come settle areas in this province that they called Tejas. When the white settlers got there, they wanted to bring slaves and cotton farming, and they also wanted religious freedom, and this became a problem. The key figures in Texas independence were Sam Houston and Stephen Austin, and their names are still two of the biggest cities in the state. Their complaints with Mexico was that they wanted slaves for cotton farming, and Mexico was not necessarily all right with them importing slaves. They also wanted freedom of religion, and Mexico had demanded that the white settlers pay tithes to the Catholic Church, and the white settlers did not like that. They also wanted to continue bringing in more white settlers into the province of Tejas, and Mexico had actually banned, by the 1830s, further settlement from whites. So after declaring independence and fighting a war to actually gain their independence from Mexico, Texas was finally annexed by the USA in 1845. Now, during this period, there was a tremendous amount of westward migration. Here you can see in the chart that in the 1840s and 1850s, there were tens of thousands. It's the number of immigrants, people moving westward in the tens of thousands. So you can see about 70,000 people moving in the early 1850s along the Oregon, California, and Utah trails. And in part, this was due to this romantic notion of moving west, that there was undeveloped territory out west, and with that came infinite opportunity and an abundance of space and resources in which someone could settle without necessarily have to worrying about the conditions of the bigger cities or the places that were already more well established. Here you can see some of these trails illustrated. The different trails westward actually stopped at points that became some of the bigger cities in the Midwest and the western United States. You could see cities like St. Louis, you can see cities like Santa Fe, you can see cities like Salt Lake City. A lot of these places were stopping points along these westward trails, and it's eventually how they developed. And here you can see a depiction of the kind of covered wagon train that would often move settlers out west. In addition to Texas, California actually experimented with independence as well. But whereas there were tens of thousands of American settlers in Texas, in California there were only about 500, and the Bear Flag Republic, the independence from Mexico for California, was short-lived. But that would all change once America goes to war with Mexico. Essentially, America bullied Mexico into this war. They sent a man named John Slidell, a trade commissioner, into Mexico to make certain kinds of demands. They wanted more land in Texas. They demanded New Mexico and California, although they did offer money and they were willing to pay whatever Mexico wanted to purchase California. But the Mexican government refused, and the president at the time, James Polk, who believed in manifest destiny, ordered troops into disputed territory. This was illegal, and it provoked a response from Mexico. Now, this is not to say that America was all on board with going to war with Mexico. In fact, America was divided. The Democratic Party, the pro-slavery party of the South, wanted new territory to expand slavery into. And they actually sided with the war and wanted manifest destiny to be realized. However, the Whig Party was anti-slavery, and they actually revolted against this war. Famously, American author Henry David Thoreau landed himself in jail by refusing to pay his taxes to support this war. But with very little debate, Congress declared war on Mexico in 1846 after fairly suspicious reasons for entering into disputed territory. After the war was over, after General Old Fuss and Feathers Winifred Scott, who became one of the famous generals, and there's also General Zachary Taylor, became very famous in this war as well. He went on to become president shortly after this war. But after the war, there was a huge cost in American lives as well as money, but it brought in a tremendous amount of new territory. And with this 1 million square miles of new land came the issue of slavery and whether or not to allow slavery in these new territories. But manifest destiny was certainly partially realized at this point, and we'll see in a later unit that manifest destiny begins to spread beyond the boundaries of the United States in a later part of the 1800s. So here is the territory that the United States gained after the Mexican conflict. And with it came a huge part of American culture. The notion of the Wild West becomes a genre of American culture. And in this genre, there was a very racialized kind of undertone, always, that the settlers were generally civilized, and they were pitted against savage Indians and a lawless environment where there were bandits and gangs of thieves. This popular culture, historians have argued that the popular culture images, depictions of the Wild West tended to exaggerate the dangers of other people, especially, and perhaps understate some of the dangers of nature. One of the things that motivated Western migration as well as a notion of manifest destiny was the idea that one could get rich. And this was further supported when people like John A. Sutter struck gold in California in 1848. And this led to a massive gold rush in 1849, which is where the name 49ers actually comes from the San Francisco football team is named after gold rushers prospectors who came out looking for spikes in gold. You can see in 1849 there was a huge number of immigrants arriving to San Francisco, but by later in the 50s you can see a lot of people are departing because the gold would run out quite quickly. But here you can see that in the early 1850s, San Francisco was much more hillside, smaller residences, and by the 1860s, it was relatively packed, and a lot of the nature had gone because it had gotten much more crowded. So the United States, by the 1850s, had essentially colonized coast to coast, had taken over in direct control from East Coast to West Coast. Still to this day, there is a notion that the American way of life, the American way of government, is superior, that our ideas about being able to have liberty and to speak truth to power and these kind of core values of what it means to be American are something that the rest of the world should model. And therefore, that gives America some kind of right to spread itself and to spread its influence throughout the world. This has been a justification that's been used for many, many kinds of imperialistic policies. We're going to talk about that in a later snapshot on imperialism. So in closing, have you ever heard this claim that the American way is the best in the world and maybe that others should be more like we are? How can understanding the history of this notion be important? How does learning some of the policies and events that are associated with the idea of manifest destiny and the idea of American superiority help you to understand this notion about America's way of life being the best a little bit more clearly? What are your thoughts? What do you think of this morally? How do you think it affects our politics and our ideas about how we relate to the rest of the world?